Welcome to the Department of Healthcare Access and Information, or HCAI, webinar titled HCAI CAN 1-7-153, brought to you by the Building Standards Unit here at HCAI. This presentation will go over changes to projects under HCAI jurisdiction that do not materially alter the approved work, also known as NMAs. As described in the California Administrative Code, Section 7-153B, non-material changes do not require submission of an amended construction document or ACD to the office. So today we're going to be going over code requirements, definitions, contents of the code application notice, and examples, tips, and much, much more. If you haven't done so already, feel free to download a PDF copy of this presentation available to you in the Go-To toolbox under the handout section of the Go-To webinar toolbox there on your screen. We're scheduled to be here for about an hour and a half, which includes a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. And we may even finish a little earlier, so that if we do, that's quite all right. If you have a question during the presentation, please type your question into the question section of the Go-To panel, and we'll answer them the best we can towards the end of the presentation. Be sure to keep your questions generic. If you have a specific question, feel free to send your email over to regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. Again, that's regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. If the presentation experiences transmission difficulties, please log out and log back in using the same login information sent to you by the Go-To software when you registered for the presentation. Today for a presenter, we have Mr. Richard Tannehill, who is the Deputy Division Chief here at HCAI. In the background, we're also going to be having some of the other HCAI team members answering questions as you submit those in writing. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the presentation. Richard, the presentation's all yours.
Thank you, Caesar. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We've had the revised CAN 1-7-153 for non-material altered out for about a year now. We've gotten a lot of feedback on it. Initially, some not so good, but since then, it's been very good once people started using it. Through the feedback we got, we actually are amending it slightly and we'll be updating it in the next week or so. So you are going to be seeing the most recent copy of this, and you'll have to check in like a week or two to get the final download from our website. I'm also, like Caesar said, I'm Richard Tannehill, the Deputy Division Chief for OSHPD under HCAI, and I'm going to ask Caesar to also chime in on occasion if he sees anything that I need to clarify, since he's a regional compliance officer out in the field and has a lot of knowledge on this as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I just already introduced myself. We are partnered with the AIA California, so if you do need your continuing education credits, there will be a certificate available, but it's only one certificate per logon. So if you are in a group that is multiple people watching, you only get one certificate. The others will have to self-report for that. Again, we're scheduled for about an hour and a half. As Caesar said, there's only like 25, 26 slides here. So we'll be doing some Q&A. So we'll probably be right around the hour mark, I would guess. So to start off on our website, the HCAI website, if you go under codes and regulations, you will find the CAN. Currently, this is what's available, CAN 1-7-153. The revised copy will have a B153B. The B is for the chapter for non-material altered, and we'll be focusing on that. You'll have copies of a Word document and Excel for that, as well as we're going to be attaching the form that we'll be discussing later on as a standalone document. As I said, we are going to be renaming this to 153B, and we have renamed it to non-material alterations. So that's more in line. Everyone calls it the NMA CAN and stuff, but so it's more in line with what we're calling it and what we're discussing on a daily basis. As again, this will be, the effective dates will be in the next week or two and will be released as a brand new copy of that. Now, that being said, the process isn't changing, the content, the purpose behind it isn't changing. What we're doing, we're adding some clarifications from questions we received in the field and some revisions that we feel need to be made. So you see some of the text shifted, some of the organization shifted a little bit, but the process, if you attended last time or if you're familiar with the process, that is not changing. It's going to be the same requirements, and we will go over that today as well. So material alter is applied to construction projects or approved construction documents, means any change, alteration, or modification as determined by the office that alters the scope of a project, could cause the project to be in non-compliance with the code, or causes unreasonable risk to the health, safety of patients, staff, or public. That's the definition of materially altered. Okay. The reason we're getting into that is because we're going to define also what's non-material. So if you're meeting these requirements, these are ACDs. Okay. So changes to the approved work 157-153A basically states that any changes to the approved construction documents do require an amended construction document to be approved by the office or an ACD to be approved by the office. Okay, this work would include corrections of errors in design and or construction of bin construction documents or construction into compliance with the code, or changes to the scope of work and additional work required because of discovered conditions. Only changes that materially alter the work shall be submitted to the office for review and approval as amended construction documents or ACDs. Okay, only if it's materially altered, you need to submit it for review and approval. So continuing on to, this is more the bulk of this, is what's non-material altered. The following types of changes in work do not materially alter the work and do not require submission of amended construction documents to the office. That does not mean that we do not need to see them. It just means we're not going to review them. We do need to concur with them. So I'm going to go through there's 8 items that qualify as non-material. So I'm going to go through them one at a time. The first one are clarifications and interpretation of the plans and specifications by the design professional responsible charge of their work. Okay. If calculations by a structural engineer are necessary to determine the structural and non-structural adequacy, an ACD shall be submitted to the office for review. Now, that being said, structural calcs by themselves do not make a non-material alter change material. It basically, if those calcs are required to justify it, then it is an ACD. And we see a lot of structural engineers add calcs to basically back up the design, even though they may not be necessary. And in that case, an NMA can still be submitted. So the structural calcs within themselves do not negate an NMA, but just be very cautious about using them, because a lot of people will look at them, say there's structural calcs involved, this disqualifies it. Because you'll see there's going to be time limitations on the review. So if that is needed, you're probably looking at an ACD. Construction, number 2 is construction means and methods, such as sequencing for construction, coordination of the work and methods of assembly and construction. Construction means and methods do not include work that would require an alternate method of compliance or an alternate method of protection. Okay, temporary construction. Sorry if I'm reading some of this, it's just basically word for word. This is a very concise wording from the CAN. So hopefully I'll try to explain it as we go through. But temporary construction, such as temporary exiting or air handlers, bulk oxygen tanks, or shoring support of an occupied building or office, are considered means and methods, and thus are not considered means and methods, and thus would require a permit for that type of work. So those would not be considered non-material. So how items are basically straight from the administrative code. Pretty much the first line states what's non-material, then the notes typically show would be the exception to that, which would make them material. So number 3, substitution of equipment, products, or materials that must be code compliant, that they perform the same function as the equipment, product, or material it is replacing, and must not increase the mechanical, electrical loads of the building, and must not increase loads or lateral gravity load bearing structural frame members, and must meet the design requirements of the project. Those are all non-material. Okay, changing from one type of equipment, product, material, such as changing from drilled in concrete anchors to concrete screw anchors, or changing the top of wall fire resistive material design are not considered substitutions. Those are revisions to the design and require submittal of amended construction documents or ACDs to the office for review or the field. Again, if calculations by a structural engineer are necessary to determine structural, non-structural adequacy, keyword here being necessary, and an ACD must also be submitted for review. Item 4, this is probably the one that causes the most confusion, and it will be changing in the intervening code cycle, but currently it requires that new details that are based on other approved details in whole or in part, including reference standards or pre-approved details, are considered non-material. You must reference the existing approved details to use this statement. This adds a lot of confusion, so it is actually going to be revised in the intervening code. I won't get into that right now because it just added additional confusion, because as of now, this is the wording and this is what will be applied. Number 5 is a final routing configuration of ducts, conduits, or pipes, or anything that's shown diagrammatically in the approved plans that now you get shop drawings, or et cetera, to basically assemble those and actually install them on the project. That does not require an ACD, long as the actual configuration, point A to point B, is not changing, or if there's nothing else required, such as you're now penetrating firewalls or fire partitions. So an ACD would need to be required if additional fire smoke dampers are being added, if you're adding any seismic fittings, or specifically engineered braces or hangers to be necessary to accommodate the final configuration of routing. So the idea is that when you submit a set of plans, include what we call anticipated details. You may not know exactly where they're going to go, but you're going to probably use them. Go ahead and include them in there, and when they're needed, they're already part of the set. Number 6 are dimensional changes to rooms that do not affect code required minimum dimensions. Fixed dimensions or minimum room clearances. So basically you can do what you need, shift things around, long as they don't change what the minimum requirements by code are. And it's up to the design professional record to make that determination, or the engineer record for that portion of work. Okay, so the exception to this are applicable code sections and minimum dimension space requirements must be shown on plans for confirmation for OSHPD staff. So that doesn't make it an ACD, but you do need to show any dimensional changes and keep the required clearances on the drawing so that our staff can concur with it. So if you're shifting a door to the left 5-6 inches, a foot, whatever it might be, that's fine. That's an NMA. You need to make sure that the required clearances are there for accessibility and any clearances required within the room. Same with electrical outlets. Typically, the rule of thumb is you can shift electrical outlets on the wall, long as you're not changing the type of wall, like going from a non-rated wall to a fire-rated wall, things like that. Relocation of doors, windows, electrical switches, actually this is the same thing from the one above, that do not require additional changes to the work to make the relocation compliant. As I said, if you're still meeting the code requirements, these things are fine to be shifted. If you're adding anything new, that would be an ACD, because you're adding load in most cases. And number 8 is the last one, relocation or reconfiguration of cabinetry that does not affect code required minimum changes. This is Basically, cabinets can be replaced in kind or very similar as an NMA and does not require an ACD. Okay, such cabinetry reconfigurations have increased load to the structural supports or framing or the ceiling that which it came from. Okay, and basically kind of the rule of thumb for these is you can't put anything in that's going to make it non-code compliant. So continuing on, those were the 8 items that qualify as non-material altered. Okay, but continue on. If the architect or engineer in responsible charge of the project determines that the changes to the approved construction documents are necessary that do not materially alter the work, they still need to stamp and sign the drawings, okay, as they would any other change, as they do with the regular projects. All changes in the work are subject to the concurrence of the OSHPD field staff as to whether or not they materially alter the work. So the design professional states it's non-material altered, they have to present it to our staff and they have to concur. And we'll go through that process as well. The documentation of changes, the engineer or architect in responsible charge shall maintain a log of all changes to the work. That's actually in the code, the administrative code already under paragraph E under 7-153. That log shall indicate whether the office had made a determination to whether each change material alters the work, that the date of such determination was made, and the name of the office staff who made that determination. The log shall be maintained on the project site as part of the inspector's field records. So basically, the log of changes could include non-material changes, ACDs, RFIs, ASIs, et cetera, et cetera. There just needs to be a log documenting the changes. That's nothing new that's being required. That's always been there. It's just kind of clarifying that the NMA should be tracked on there as well. As part of the CAN, there is a form that needs to be submitted with each NMA. This form is part of the CAN. It's also going to be uploaded as a separate adjacent file on our website that you can just use that file. Right now, we're having people submit the entire NMA or the NMA CAN with the NMA. All you need is this sheet, the form. So that will be provided separately. And what we're asking for is the bare minimum to get this approved as quickly as possible. The whole idea is an NMA by its definition is non-materially altering the project. It's very simple. That's why they're allowed to be done as non-ACDs. So the idea is that you can tell us what it is and we can basically concur with you, even maybe without even seeing drawings. But we do ask that you do provide some type of drawings to show what the change is and what it's and where it's located. So we need your standard information here. The design professional does need to stamp and sign the drawings as this is part of an instrument of service. And then there's a spot here for our field staff to concur with the change. The quick description of what's changing and a list of attachments. Again, the description should be enough that we can look at it and read it and hopefully determine that if it's NMA just by the description. If that's the case, we may not even need to look at the drawings. But if there's any drawings or references that are attached, go ahead and list them here. At the bottom here, you'll see these should be familiar. You have your 1 through 8. These are the items we just went through. You do need to identify which of these 8 items qualifies it as an NMA just by checking the box here. Okay. We do need an NMA specific number for these. If you're submitting RFIs or ASIs as NMAs, that's fine. You can put contractor RFI, but it does need a distinct NMA number. So it can be RFI 55, NMA 5. Not all RFIs are NMAs. We don't review RFIs. We don't review ASIs. But if you want to convert that, if it's making a change to the documents and you need to record that, you need to add an NMA number to that.
Hey, Richard, if I can ask you a question, is it okay to provide more than one proposed change or NMA in one form?
No, one NMA form for each change. Good question, and we'll cover that more later. The NMA form, the whole idea of this is to make it very fast, very simple for our staff to look at it and concur and move on. The benefit of the NMA is because they're considered non-material altered is you can proceed with work, the construction prior to the concurrence of an NMA. So the idea is that they're very simple, they're very basic, and they can be reviewed very quickly. Once you start adding 2, 3, 4 NMAs to the form, now you've just extended the time that's going to take to review it. And if one of those doesn't qualify, all of them get kicked out. So one form per NMA. Again, that's actually a point of contention we originally had when we first started this. A lot of complaints about an increasing workload. And a lot of those same people that complained wrote to me afterwards and said, never mind, this is working really good. So hopefully most of y'all agree with that. So good question. Again, this form can be separated, will be able to be separate, downloaded separate from the CAN in the future, once soon as we get posted. And don't send in the entire CAN with the NMA form if you're using the old one. You should have a typo here. This is just, and again, this is the form, this is the log. These are just examples. Everybody can create their own, but they do need a minimum of these requirements on their own form. Okay, this is the minimum that we're looking at. Every firm, every job site, however you want to do it, can have their own version of this. We're not requiring you to use these. These are just examples of what we need to see. So on the log, again, when it was issued, the document name, the NMA number, again, that's very important. What is the change and so forth. And again, this is not something that HCAI staff is going to sign. We're not going to, what we're going to do is give you a copy of the form back that'll be signed with concurrence. And this is just for your use, this column, to say, yes, we received concurrence. Usually you put a date, maybe initials of who reviewed it, but we are not going to physically do that. So don't ask us to, please. Okay, and also if it becomes an ACD, it's a way to track. That was not concurred with it, now it becomes an ACD, so you can track the number for your log. Okay, getting back to the text of the CAN. The purpose of this CAN is to clarify what is materially altering changes and non-material. Okay, that's pretty simple. The background of this is that the administrative code and the building code basically state that any change to a project, to the drawing, approved drawings must be an ACD. Okay, and as I already went through these are ACDs, items that alter the scope of the project, could cause a project to be in non-compliance with the code, or cause unreasonable risk to the health and safety of patients, staff, or public. We do recognize that there are changes that would not require an ACD. Okay, so that's why we have created the NMA, or the non-material altered category. Okay, all changes do need to be submitted to the office, either an NMA or an ACD prior to the installation of work. Actually, an NMA can be done after the installation of work, so we need to change the wording on that. But we do need to see them. Okay, so if you do an NMA, does not mean that we don't need to see them. We do need to see them. We do need to concur with them. So again, we recognize that not all changes are material, so we wrote this CAN to provide that clarification. So our interpretations are that any non-material altered change that does not materially alter the work, an ACD is changes to construction documents that do materially alter the work. Therefore, the office will only review the changes that do materially alter the work. And the keyword there is review. We do not review changes. For NMAs, we just look at them and concur that they are not NMAs. That's why, again, it's supposed to be super fast. Stamping and signing by the architect or engineer. Again, this follows the same process for any ACD or approved drawing. It's under 7-115 of the administrative code, and it requires that the engineer of record, in this case, let me just read through this because we'll get into more detail here. When the design professional record determined the proposed change does not materially alter the work, the NMA is required to be issued. Stamping and signing the NMA documents by the architect or engineer represents that they are accepting responsibility that the NMA will not cause the project to be in non-compliance. That is why we require the stamp and signature. Okay. The change log and the change form are just tools to track the changes and or get the concurrence. The change form is for that concurrence. They will be issued along with any NMA. So the change log and change form, along with any issued narratives or other associated documents such as RFIs, ASIs, supplemental instructions, CCDs, shall be maintained on the project site as part of the inspection field records. That is in the administrative code. All changes in the work are subject to concurrence of HCAI field staff as to whether material alters the work or not. The architect or engineer responsible charge shall maintain the log, which all changes of the work are clearly recorded and identified as either materially altered or not. This concurrence shall be determined by a review of the required change form. This is the Appendix B. This is the form we just looked at, and it will be submitted with each NMA request. So one NMA per change form. The change form should have the details such as references or narratives or drawings or sketches that offer enough definition that the field staff can make their concurrence. Okay, we're going to talk about the time limitations here in a second. The change log shall be maintained by the design professional of record and accompany the change form. So a copy of it may be requested when you're submitting the NMA so they can kind of track if there's anything else coming, et cetera, that it's on there. The idea, again, I keep saying this, is that they may be able to look at the log and say, yeah, I concur. Okay, we do have some people asking our field staff to sign the log instead of the form. You do need the form signed for your concurrence, okay? A rejection or non-concurrence of an NMA requires that proposed revision to be submitted to the office to review as an ACD. So if it's not an NMA, you're going to be asked to submit it as an ACD. And you're putting yourself at risk there because some of the work may have proceeded, and that so we don't want design professionals to be coerced into making ACDs, NMAs. So you need to be very careful about that because, and we'll get into this later, that you may have to uncover any work done that is not qualified as an NMA. We're trying to make it, again, we're trying to make this very simple and very clear of what would meet the NMA requirements. Again, the office does not perform plan review or code analysis on NMAs, and concurrence is determined by the field staff based on the information provided by the DPOR. In other words, we can only concur with what you have given us. If all the information isn't there, is not presented, it may be a problem, may become an ACD and cause more problems, okay? In other words, don't hide your work. One of the things also with an NMA, to keep it simple, if you're making a dimensional change to a wall, you can do it on one floor plan. You don't need to submit the floor plan, the ceiling plan, the interior elevations, all that. Just show the change. You can document it on your plans, and we'll talk about that later as well. But we only need to see what the actual change is and what it will impact. Okay, concurrence will only be noted on the NMA form. That's where we require the form. Our field staff will stamp and or sign the form and give it back to you. That's your record that it's been reviewed, okay? They will not stamp and sign the drawings, just the form. The change log itself is for observation only and of the quantity of NMA changes assigned to the project. It's just a tracking mechanism. When submitting documents as NMA for concurrence to the office, include the following on each change form: the HCAI/OSHPD number and a unique NMA identifier. That is very important. We need the NMA to be specifically identified. Stamp and signature from the architect or engineer responsible in charge of the project. And we'll talk about that more on the next slide. Adequate description of the proposed NMA. Again, if we can just read the description and concur with it, we will. All reference documents listed on the change form shall be made available as required to make a determination. Additional structural support, updated air balance, electrical calculations. It could be floor plans that may not be changing, but just get a reference. They may ask for what was this before. So anything you can help us to understand what the change is to what it was before, what it's changing to, can help expedite the process of the NMA concurrence. Must have reference to at least one specific section of the 8 items that we looked at earlier. And the change form shall have no more than one change. So what Caesar was asking about a few minutes ago. And shall identify what section it meets. So that's again one of those 8 items. Okay, moving in the cabinet may include a power outlet, light fixture, etc. That is considered one change and does not need multiple NMAs to move the cabinet, one for the outlet, one for the light fixture, etc. You just need one NMA to show that you're changing the cabinet, and because of that, these light fixtures or electrical outlets may be shifting. Just show that on one drawing. If that's sufficient, it will be concurred with. Stamping and signing. This is an area that causes a lot of confusion. 7-115 clearly states what needs to be stamped and signed and how to do it. Okay, so the signature from the architect or engineer that is in responsible charge of the project, only the signature, and a stamp and signature of the architect or the engineer that is preparing the changes is required on the drawings. Okay. On the form itself, the stamp and signature from the architect or engineer responsible charge of the project. They are the one making the determination if it's a non-material altered change or not. And in any form is an instrument of service. Here's some basic rules that we're following for the processing of NMAs. Concurrence will be generally no more than a 5-minute observation for each NMA. Each NMA evaluation shall be accepted or denied based on the field staff's decision and does not involve iterations or back and forth interaction between the staff, field staff, and the design professional. Again, make it very, very clear what the change is and that it's an NMA and move on. It's not to be debated. Okay, if it is debated, it is an ACD. That means it wasn't that clear. Again, referencing one of the 8 items. I won't go through all of these, but again, just a checkbox. It's all a check or a mark, an X, whatever you want to do to show this is why we're saying it's an NMA. And an NMA may be submitted in many formats. Again, you can submit an RFI, ASI, SI, etc. as an NMA, but it needs a distinct NMA number and tracked as an NMA. Again, HCAI does not review RFIs or ASIs, but we do need to concur if it's becoming an NMA. We don't need to see every RFI. We don't review them. There may be a lot of RFIs. That may be what color is this wall? It's changing from red to yellow or whatever. We don't need to see that. We don't care. Note, any work performed based on non-materially altered position that is found to be material will be subject to review and possible destructive investigation. That's what I'm saying. We don't want, just for the sake of keeping the project moving, do it as an NMA when you know there's an ACD is actually required. Okay, you may have to go back and open up what was done to show that it was actually, it's now an ACD to show it was actually done. During the office field staff concurrence of NMA documents, the office representative determines that if the office representative determines that the DPOR has repeatedly not followed the directions in this CAN, it can be reported to the RCO, and the allowance to proceed with the work prior to concurrence may be revoked. There is nothing in the code that allows the work to continue without previously being approved. So that's basically an allowance that we're providing for NMAs. So it's basically a privilege, if you will. And if it is repeatedly being violated, it can be revoked. Okay, we do not want to see any RFIs or ASIs. Okay, we don't review them. We don't want to see them. We do not review RFIs or ASIs. An RFI or an ASI may become an NMA. They may be converted to an NMA if there is a design change that needs to be concurred with. Okay, we do want to see those. So make sure we do see any NMA if it is already. Again, we said we don't review the RFIs and ASIs, but they can be converted to an NMA, and we can concur with those. There's a lot of example pages in the CAN that we're not going to go through the specifics of them. They're all being updated and clarified. This is Appendix A of that, but we have them for all these different disciplines. So when you get the NMA, you can go ahead and review that and apply it as necessary. And part of the revision is it's not only from the feedback we received, but also we're coordinating the Freer's manual and the remodel CAN and this material NMA CAN so that they're all coordinated. There's hopefully no conflicts between them. Appendix A is, like I said, includes the changes that material alter the work and do not material work. There will be examples of both, non-material as well as material. Okay. Appendix B is the change form. And again, it can be downloaded, will be able to be downloaded separately. Please only submit this one form with your NMA. Appendix C is this an example of the change log. Again, the change log is required by the administrative code, so just have it on site or available if staff need to see it. You cloud the change, identify NMA number with a delta, and you're done. That's all that's needed. You don't need to have the whole sheet reapproved. Now, if that delta and NMA, it's treated just like an RFI, they're carried forward for the project. Okay, there's no need to have an NMA converted into an ACD. We're almost on the last couple slides here. So tips for NMAs. Determine, first of all, if an NMA is actually an NMA and not an ACD. If an NMA, you can proceed to item 2. If it's an ACD, submit it as such. Prepare the log and the forms. Okay, the log and the NMA form are required for the NMA review. With the log, provide a description, and the form, provide a description so that a decision can be made based on it. Avoid the use of the word miscellaneous. In your description of the change, don't say miscellaneous electrical revisions or miscellaneous structural revisions. Be specific. If we read the description and agree with it as an NMA, that may be all we need to do. We can sign it off and, we can sign it off and move on. An NMA number must be assigned regardless of what the design team calls it. You can call it whatever you want, but we still need an NMA number on it. And the NMA number should be sequential, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just because you have RFI 54 doesn't make it NMA 54. It'll bring it, the NMA number to be sequential. Use proper industry terminology. We have one contractor out there that calls all changes RFIs, including our NMAs. So we don't review RFIs, so your NMAs are not going to get reviewed if you call them RFIs. So again, we need a distinct NMA number on these. Only one item per NMA. We've discussed that a couple of times already. Okay, again, this is just to keep the process very quick and flowing. And it should take no more than 5 minutes to review each item. You may have multiple disciplines related to a single item. The example we used earlier was the cabinet with the lighting and the electrical outlets moving. That's still one item. Must be a binary decision. Yes or no. Is it an NMA? No. Then it's an ACD. Okay. And the preferable answer would be, is it NMA? Yes. It's either yes or no. There's no in between. Once there's an in between, you're getting to debating it, it becomes an ACD. NMAs will be looked at when staff are on site or when other arrangements are made in advance. You can, with coordination with the field staff, you can email them. There's different ways to get it to them, to have them review it. So that's coordination with them, however they want to work. But as a general rule, they're looked at when you get to the site. And again, if you make special appointments or whatever to have them reviewed, that's fine. It's up to the individual field staff member. Okay, you can present it to our field staff. You can email them. You can have the NMA change log available when you're meeting with them. Do not convert NMAs into ACDs after concurrence. We went over that earlier. Again, we see this quite a bit. It's not needed and it's a waste of time, and you may get them that ACD kicked out as not required. If there is a question to whether or not an NMA, something is an NMA, it's okay to find out and ask the question beforehand. Actually, I want to jump back to number 8. If it's not converted, do not convert NMAs to ACDs after concurrence. It won't get kicked out. The ACD will be returned and held up until that's corrected. So it won't be returned as not required because the ACD portion of that may still be required. But back to number 9, don't be afraid to call us. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone and ask the question. Typically, it'll be with your compliance officer, fire life safety officer, or district structural engineer. Ask the question. I'm thinking about doing this. I'm not sure if it's an NMA or an ACD. Ask the question and then send them the NMA if it is determined to be so. Do not abuse the use of NMAs or be pressured into making an ACD and NMA. There are consequences. Like I said, the ability to continue with work can be revoked. We do hear a lot of design professionals saying that the contractor, because of time and schedule, they're telling them to make them NMAs. The design professional is the one making the decision, not the contractor. Your stamp and signature are on these, so please treat it as a professional document or instrument of service, and don't be pressured into making the wrong choice here just to keep the project moving. If you do have a urgent ACD, please contact your compliance officer and let them know, and there's other avenues to help expedite those. With that, I'd like to thank you all for bearing with us. Sorry for some of the glitches we had. Again, we're partnering with HCAI California, so if you want your learning units, we'll probably be going about an hour today after the Q&A, so that will be available to you. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Caesar for questions.
Great, thank you, Richard. Yeah, and apologize for the earlier glitch. That was strange, but we're here now, and we're going to go ahead and start asking these questions that you all submitted. So thank you for doing that. We have a lot of questions. Some of them are repeat, but I think they're worth kind of discussing out in the open. So the first question, Richard, that we got is having to do with structural aspects of the project. The question reads, is the lateral or gravity load of a metal stud system is 10% difference due to a gauge thickness, i.e. 16 gauge to 14 gauge, would this be a non-material change?
You're going from 16 to 14, so you're going to a thicker gauge?
Yeah, so they're going from 16 gauge to 14 gauge.
I mean, I would have to actually defer. I would say it would be an NMA because you're going to a thicker gauge, but I would consult with your DSE.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Richard. Something that should be emphasized throughout this presentation is that if you have a question about something being a possible NMA, it's your first point of contact should be your field staff, whether it's your district structural engineer, DSE, fire life safety officer, FLSO, or your compliance officer out there in the field. So have that open line of communication with them for sure. Next question reads, regarding substitutions, does changing from one fire sealant, such as Hilti, to another, such as STI, require an NMA or ACD or neither?
If they're in a listed system, it's a NMA.
Perfect. Okay. Next question reads, in regards to construction means and methods, it sounds like temporary construction barriers are now being considered material altering changes. Can you please confirm if a temporary barrier being installed for an already approved OSHPD project, rated or not, requires an ACD?
It depends. It really does. Most of them are going to be NMAs. We change construction barriers all the time, but it goes back to what is the project? Why is the temporary barrier required? Is it I don't know if the question said it was non-fire rated or not. You have to look at the situation. If it is required for protection for fire rating, say, and is basically replacing another wall at that time, it's probably going to be an ACD. If it's non-rated and it's just being moved to protect the occupants from the construction, it's probably an NMA. Those shift all the time. It may not even require an NMA in some cases, and just part of construction means and methods. I don't agree. Caesar, if you agree with that.
I do agree with that. And I'll add to what you said. It could be that the approved construction documents include temporary construction barriers, whether, let's say they're rated. That change is potentially an ACD, not an NMA. So just to reinforce what you said, Richard, I agree with that. Monica, if you're there, you're a compliance officer out in the field. What are your thoughts about that?
I agree exactly for what you and Richard are saying, because it depends from the project. So it's not possible just to give a general answer.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And going back, reach out to your compliance officer, FLSO, or DSE out in the field. They're there to communicate. They're there to help. So feel free to have that open line of communication. All right. Next question reads, this is electrical scope. It says, for electrical scope, if there is a net load reduction in line with an NMA guidelines, where does OSHPD want to see the updated panel schedules? Also, does this fall under item 7, example, outlet removed?
My answer to that would be, if you're reducing load, it's an NMA. And again, what you want to present is the updated panel schedule to show that there is a change, that there's no additional load that's being reduced. But that would be part of the NMA. It's not an ACD. It's just a way of how you're going to document and clearly show what you're changing to the compliance officer. And again, Caesar, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have nothing to add to that. Monica, anything else?
What I would like to add is sometimes there is a confusion exactly for the load on the panel. And sometimes the NMA shows some update without really highlighting the increase of the load. So one thing that we want to encourage is for the electrical engineer to double check the actual work, because if there is an additional load, of course, that one can forced to have an ACD. So always touch base with us, with the compliance officer on site, and open communication. That's the key, I think.
Great, thank you, Monica. Richard, can I ask you to flip back to the example, to the page, the slide where it has the examples of NMAs, those snippets that you provided? And the reason is the question that we have here, right there.
It's actually near the beginning. Near there.
The question, it reads, can you provide examples of something that does not require either an NMA or ACD, something that can remain RFI or DPOR direction only?
Well, the simple answer is colors. You're changing a color or a certain type of material, who cares? That's the simple one. There's also going to be some clarifications. Even item 1 says clarification of interpretation of plans and specifications. If there's a missing dimension on a floor plan for a wall, it's 5 feet, it just wasn't shown. The art contractor writes, what's this dimension? 5 feet, that's an RFI. We don't need to see that. You're not changing what's in the building. You're not changing anything physical. You're just providing clarifying information to the contractor. That's probably one of the better examples.
Perfect.
Is that?
Yeah, that answers the question. Question regarding electrical scope. The question reads, the original HCAI approved construction document has 2 20-amp power outlets. We only need 1. Can we use the NMA to reduce the scope of work to remove 1 power outlet, or is this an ACD?
In most cases, that's going to be an NMA, but again, it's going to depend on the scope, the extent of that. Again, that would be a conversation with your compliance officer. But again, typically, if you're reducing or just changing the scope and staying the same, or the load, it's typically an NMA. There may be occurrences if you're removing scope from a project, it will be an ACD because we have to verify that that removal of scope keeps the project in compliance with the code. So again, it depends on the extent of the removal, but if you just have 2 circuits running, you only need 1, typically that's an NMA. It's not required, not needed.
Yeah, a lot depends on the scope of work and how it's going to affect, the coordination studies, for example, on electrical systems. So it's something that, we need to have a better understanding of what the proposal is as we move forward with these NMAs. Richard, question on the NMA form. Does a submitter of the NMA need to be a licensed professional, or can it be a delegate?
The person who's stamping and signing it needs to be a licensed professional. Now, a delegate, just to be clear, is another licensed professional. An alternate is also. Now, if they have somebody else that's helping on the project, they cannot stamp and sign the form. The design professional of record needs to stamp and sign the form. Okay, a delegate is basically someone that's assigned a different responsibility. Just to, again, it's probably not your question, but just want to be clear on that. So the NMA form does need to be signed by the design professional record, which needs to be a licensed professional. Now, it can be submitted by a non-licensed professional to the compliance officers. Your field staff out there from the firm may not be licensed. That's fine. It can be submitted and stuff, but they just can't stamp and sign it and say it's an NMA. Same with the any changes to the drawings need to be by the engineer of record for those changes.
Great, thank you, Richard. Next question is a good question. The question reads, yes, Monica?
Can I add for the delegate, in order to be a delegate, it needs to be provided to us as a delegate, that specific person, and we can see that delegate under the professionals into ESP.
So that's a very good point, Monica. And the reason that Monica mentions that is in the project record. If the process is followed to add a professional to the project, that professional is going to be listed as an approved professional for that specific project. under our files. So make sure that the person who is submitting that NMA actually is approved for the project by submitting the proper application and forms. Because if that person is not, then the NMA may not be valid as proposed. Thank you, Monica, for that. Anything else? Okay. Question regarding the form. Is the change form from the CAN required, or can a form of our own creation with all of this information be used?
I believe that's, oops. The form is an example. I'll go to it, jump here, sorry. This problem with animation takes forever. These are just examples. So yes, you can, I believe I said that earlier on. This can be done by firm, it can be done by project, etc. This is just an example that can be used. It does need to include the information that we're requesting here.
Perfect. Okay. A little more clarification is being asked about the DPOR stamp. The question reads, for NMA form, for the DPOR stamp, should that be provided by the primary DPOR or per discipline?
By the primary. They're ultimately making the decision that this is an NMA. They're ultimately in charge of the project. Now the drawings, if there are drawings attached, those would be by the engineer or architect making the change. And those would require only the stamp and signature by the person making the change and the signature only of the DPOR. But the DPOR is making the decision if this is a non-material altered change versus an ACD. So they're the one making that call. Now they may be basing it on what their consultant's telling them. That's fine, but they're the ones in charge of the project and making the decision. So that's why the DPOR stamp and signature would be here.
Yeah, all right, Richard, and I just remembered of a question that I was asked out in the field about NMAs and the amount of NMAs per project. So is there a limit as to the amount of NMAs on one specific project to where it would turn into an ACD, for example, 10, 15 NMAs, or is one NMA at a time okay?
One NMA at a time is okay. That's actually one of the reasons we do that, is so you don't group them and make it an ACD. Again, the idea, NMAs can be reviewed very quickly and very promptly. So they, so anyway, that's my answer, yes.
All right. Next question, materially alter note number 4. When providing alternate anchorage detail on approved detail and structural calcs is not required, is that an NMA? And if the alternate detail requires structural calcs, is that an ACD?
The second part of that's yes. I'm not sure I understood the first part. This one's very confusing. We had one that was a window infill in a wood framed wall that was approved. So now they get out to the site and they have a brick wall. They want to use that same detail and put it in a brick wall and base it on the other detail. And it's like, where do you draw that line as when it becomes you have different anchorage, you have different wall types. So we determined that would be an ACD. So that's why this language is actually going to be revised in the intervening code to only allow listed or pre-approved details. Because you can still do it if there's a slight change. Like I said, this language is in there. We will work with you on it. But this one confuses everybody, including us. So, to use a good example of what would meet this, I don't have one. So, that unless it's listed or pre-approved, I think that's where they're going. But if you're, again, using the window replacement detail, if it's going from a very similar situation to a different situation that's very similar, that would probably be an NMA. And again, it would depend on the project, on the scope of that change. So again, I'll be forthright with you. This causes a lot of confusion, and a lot of these do get rejected because they are not considered similar enough. So that's why we're changing it. So I don't have a good answer for you, but it is being changed because of that reason.
Great, thank you, Richard. The next question is asking, what is the process to submit NMAs? And if I can chime in on that one, the process really initially starts with your conversation with the field staff, is having the IOR involved, having the field staff, whether they're the DSC, a FALISO, or CO involved, having that open line of communication is the first step, right? And after that conversation with the field staff, the field staff will be able to provide you direction whether it's an NMA or not, and then that it gets drafted up, it gets submitted on the form that was shown as the example, or your own or the DPOR's own form, and concurrence will be provided or not provided by the field staff that way. Richard or Monica, anything else to add to that?
No, there's also, like, if you're going to the field, and I'll let Monica chime in, but if you're scheduled time, we expect an agenda when the field staff goes to the site. If you want a half hour to review NMAs, put it on the agenda. Again, this should become routine after you use it a few times. But there's many ways you can contact our field staff. Like Cesar said, the first thing to do is communicate. What do you want to do?
Yes, I want to reinforce what Richard and Cesar are saying. One thing, for example, I have projects where the design professional knows that I am weekly at the job site, so we are going to start to have NMAs to be reviewed on site, or sometimes also what I propose in order to simplify. It depends also the type of the project. To have offsite NMA review. So we go through teams, and that would be kind of equal to be on site and review the NMA. But anyway, needs to have the form in order for us to concur.
Right, thank you, Monica. And Monica, this next question, I believe, is I can probably ask you to answer it. What is the process, or does HCAI memorialize the concurrence of NMAs? How do we do that?
I don't see the question there, but what we do is there is the form that is sent to us, and there is the log, and there are the drawings, right? Drawings that needs to be stamped and signed. If we concur, and needs to be, of course, by email, or sometimes if he's on site, we can sign under the box of the concurrence. We just sign off that box to say that we concur. One way or another one anyway, if he is on site with a pen, or if he is by email, we say that we concur, and is a good diligence for the design professional, because per code requirement to maintain the log updated. So as soon basically that we concur to the NMA, the design professional updates the log to say yes on that specific NMA that has been concurred. And if it's not, sometimes happens that we ask for some clarification, but clarification that still falls into the NMA. So once that we receive still is an NMA and we concur, sometimes if we start to ask more questions and the problem gets deeper, that NMA is not anymore an NMA, and we per email we said that specific change doesn't fall into the NMA requirement, therefore an ACD is required. And then the design professional tells us to the field staff, is that okay to submit the ACD and have a field review, or needs to go to the office, and then is the next step.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, Monica, our field staff, we keep notes, and we keep track of these NMAs as well in the project file under our system as well. So that's another way that we keep track.
Yeah, but it's up to the design professional record to memorialize it, if you will.
Yes.
To keep the forms.
All right, next question. The question reads, did I hear correctly that Richard said construction may continue, including making the NMA changes prior to review with HCAI field staff?
Go for it, Cesar.
Yes. The answer is yes.
We can hear from two different people.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason for the NMA change is really non-material, right? And it's a change to the project, but it's not going to be a huge change to the approved construction documents. And for that reason, the changes may be made prior to the submittal, prior to the concurrence of the NMA, provided that the changes are compliant with code. Right, so there's that if the changes are compliant with code, those changes may proceed prior to concurrence.
And we get a lot of people calling our field staff and saying, we need these NMAs approved so we can keep working. No, you don't. You can continue to work. Don't wait for the NMA concurrence, but just make sure they're truly NMAs, because that's where you get yourself into trouble.
All right, next question. We're almost done with the questions here. Oh, we have more coming in. But the next question reads, does HCAI require any bulletins or specific ACDs showing all changes caused by NMAs, or is the final construction document with NMA updates only live outside of the HCAI office?
I think the latter. I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but we don't require you to show us anything of approved drawings at the end of the project.
Perfect.
So I don't know, did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So no, you don't need to resubmit anything to us to, like I said, we don't memorialize it, the design professional does.
Yeah, and that NMA log is important to keep track of.
Yeah, but we don't keep that. We don't take it at the end of a project. We don't have anything to do with that afterwards. Same with the drawings. We don't want a record set of drawings. We don't keep any of that.
All right, next question. Does HCAI have a preference or best practice on revision numbering or tagging changes on drawings? With so many different RFI, NMA, and ACD numbers on a project, revision numbering can be complex and confusing.
No, we just required that the NMA number be unique for that NMA and that you annotate it on the drawings. Like I said, pretty much with the cloud and delta, it's up to you. If it's clear, it would be okay to us, as long as we can see that there was a NMA affected this area. That's how you document it on your drawings. We do not want an ACD to memorialize any of this. It just put it a cloud and a delta on the drawings to note it that something on that drawing in that area has changed, and based on that NMA number.
All right, thank you for that, Richard. It looks like we're still getting questions about who signs the change form. The question is, or it reads, architect or engineer and responsible charter delegate are both required to sign the change form.
No. Let me jump to the form here. DPOR stamp. That's all that's asked for. That's all that's on here. I'm talking about the form. This is your answer. The DPOR is the only one that has a space to stamp and sign from the design side. The drawings are completed just like any other ACD. Whoever made the change stamps and signs it, the DPOR signs it only. There's nothing new there. Okay, so just look at the form. There's only a spot for the DPOR. That'll help make it simple.
So the next question, Richard, it's asking, so an NMA does not necessarily need to be derived from an RFI. It can also be an ASI too?
It can be, we don't care what it initiated as. We just want to see an NMA. I don't care if it came from the contractor, from the architect, from the owner. Just submit the NMA. We don't care where it came from, what it started with. That's just RFIs and ASIs are a contractual method that you can communicate between the design professional and the contractor. It has nothing to do with us. If those questions that are being asked result in a change to the drawings, that's when you get us involved. And at that point, you have to decide, is it an NMA or is it an ACD?
So Richard, if the NMA is structural in nature, but the DPOR is an architect who signs the NMA form, who's responsible to sign the NMA form? Note that the NMA form asks for the DPOR, but sometimes those changes are structural. Who stamps it?
Okay, first of all, architects are allowed to sign things that are structural in nature. If it's something the DSE or the structural engineer designed and made the change for, they will stamp and sign the drawings. The architect or DPOR will sign that drawing only, just like you would on any other project. The DPOR basically is stamping and signing the form stating if it's an NMA or not. It has nothing to do with the context, the content within that NMA. It is basically their decision that it's an NMA versus an ACD. So don't get the two confused. The drawing changes are separate from the form. Does that help?
It does. It clarifies it. And again, if the person who asked that question is still a little unclear, send us an email over to regsunit@hci.ca.gov. And it goes for the same for everybody else. If any of this is still a little confusing after the presentation, or you have a specific question about a specific project, feel free to send us an email over to regsunit@hci.ca.gov. Monica, this next question, maybe you can answer. It's dealing with the relocation of an existing domestic water line. The question reads, does a relocation of an existing item, such as a domestic water line under 2-inch diameter to avoid conflict with new work, considered an NMA?
I hated to give this answer, but it depends. Because if it's just a shift that doesn't impact any other thing, yes, it's an NMA. If that shifting impacts other changes that compromise code requirement, then it's an ACD.
Yeah, just based on the question, you would typically say that's an NMA. It's just routing.
It depends, yeah. In the overall, yes.
Where you're rerouting to, what you're going through, there's a lot of implication to that. But it's simple. If I'm moving it over 5 feet because it doesn't fit, has to go around to something, it's an NMA.
So I'd add to that.
Back up a little bit, is it may be nothing if it's that simple. You know, it's just you're just routing it and you're just changing the location of the trench that wasn't originally identified in the plans anyway. Go for it.
Yeah, and I would also add to or ask a clarifying question. What is meant by an existing item? Is it something that's poured in concrete already? You know, that's an existing part of the structure or the facility, or is it part of the scope? There's more questions that would be asked as well. So keep that in mind as you're asking these types of questions, because we at HCAI, we've also presented other presentations like on FREER manuals and things like that, and that's something that is applicable to existing structures and facilities that are outside of this presentation, but keep that in mind. So as you ask these questions to field staff, be prepared to have answers, because they may ask more questions derived from your original question. So.
That's why it said if you make the NMA as clear as possible.
Right.
If we can just read about it and answer it, we will. There's a comment on here about field staff versus office staff. Field staff do the NMA reviews.
Correct, and that's something that was asked and was answered in writing. So yes, you are correct, Richard. Any NMAs that are proposed are reviewed by the field staff and maybe concurred by field staff as well. If there is no concurrence, then that could possibly be turned into a ACD. Next question reads, there are 2 areas of the form, one for the DPOR and one for the submitter. My question was about the submitter. Can that be someone other than the DPOR?
Yes. As long as you have the stamp and signature of the DPOR, the submitter can be your field staff or your on-site staff, your CA staff, whatever it might be. As long as you have the stamp and sign for the DPOR, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't matter who actually submits it. It just matters that we have design professional record stamp and signature making that decision. So yes, sorry if I misunderstood.
All right, so what happens if changes were reflected on an ACD and subsequently considered as an NMA?
A lot of times the ACD will be kicked back as not required, and they may ask you to resubmit as an NMA. Sometimes they'll just go ahead and approve it. It just takes more time. You may not get your answer for a few weeks. And if you're waiting on construction, it's just not the quickest, most expeditious way to handle it. Do we get NMAs for ACDs? Absolutely. Most of them we will actually review, but it's going to take longer to get to. So it behooves you to know the difference or ask the question if you need, especially if you need something urgently. And if it's an NMA, please submit it as an NMA. It's going to save everybody a lot of time and money. You don't have to pay for NMAs.
All right, so Richard, can the inspection team inspect against NMAs?
You just can, as they can against an RFI. The delta on the NMA on the cloud, on the drawings, yes. That's how you document there's a change of the drawings is with that delta and cloud.
All right. Looks like we have about 9 minutes left in our presentation, so we'll try to hurry up through these. Next question is, I would like to get to clarify that a previous question, a sheet that is part of an NMA does not get any kind of HCAI stamp at concurrence. Only the NMA form shows concurrence. Doesn't this make it more difficult when looking through a field set to link up drawings and approve concurred changes?
No, those drawings do not go in the field set. The delta and the cloud that identify the NMA goes in the field set. Then you refer back to the NMA that you have, hopefully in a log or a binder somewhere, to see what that change was. We get that question a lot. It's not an issue.
What's the typical turnaround for an NMA concurrence?
I'll let you answer that one. Or Monica.
Monica, would you like to answer that one?
Ideally, a couple days. Again, is not a constraint for continuing the construction. Sometimes we receive a big wave of NMAs, and knowing the NMAs are not a priority, but other processes are a priority, might take more than even a week, but that should not panic the design professional.
Great, thank you, Monica. Next.
To add to that, it just depends on if you schedule it, it's going to be done right away. It depends how you submit it.
That's true too.
A lot of variables, but yes, I agree with what Monica said.
So if a person has 6 of the 8 type of NMAs, can they lump that all into one ACD?
Again, what you mean by, if you have 6 of the same condition being changed throughout the facility, yes, that can be into one NMA. If you're changing like a specific detail that happens at multiple locations, yes, that's one NMA. Just identify where it's happening. If you have similar details that are being changed differently and you end up with like 6 to 10 details, I would do them separately. Again, if you repeat the question, I'm not sure if I answered that right. So
yeah, the question reads, if I have 6 of the 8 type NMAs, can I lump sum these as one ACD?
6 of the what type NMAs?
6 of the 8 type NMAs. 8. Yeah, I believe they're referencing the 1 through 8.
Again, you got to use your judgment. If the field staff looks at it and says, this is going to take more than 5 minutes, I don't have time for this, it may get kicked back. If you do 6 different NMAs and they're very room by room, it's probably going to get reviewed a whole lot faster. And the reality is you can probably just Xerox your form and just submit it with each of them with a new number on them. So there's not a lot of work involved. Again, with the whole idea of this is we're trying to keep it really simple.
Richard, if an RFI requires, for example, shifting of walls that do not affect accessibility and is deemed as an NMA, can we still show the updated on our drawings? To further clarify, if at a later time the floor plan sheet with that change needs to be submitted as part of an ACD, can that change be reflected and just not clouded as part of the ACD?
Well, I was going to say yes until that last part. You still want to keep the cloud showing there was a change there based on that NMA, because you did not do an AC to change that wall location. So yes, you can shift the wall and show it on future drawings, but you should keep the cloud and delta showing that there was a change from the original approved drawings in that area.
Great, thank you. Monica, are NMAs required to be uploaded to the project record on the e-portal?
Unfortunately, no.
Oh,
Or
anything
because
else
it's
to add,
difficult
Monica?
to keep track.
There's an
It's
inside joke.
difficult to keep track on all the changes. And this is why sometimes we ask reference drawings, because not all the changes are captured into ACD, and what we can see into ESP are only the change orders. So sometimes we ask for reference drawings, and the reference drawings are in other NMAs. So, but no, unfortunately.
All right. So
Reference drawings real quick. I think I mentioned it earlier, but again, if you need to include reference drawings to clarify what the intent of that change is, please do so. Again, make it very simple. We do not require reference drawings for NMAs like we do on most ACDs, but if you think it's going to help, please include them.
The key is to help us to review as fast as possible. So the more information you provide as clear as possible, the faster it is for us to review.
and I'd like to add to what Richard and Monica said is, the the NMA log is very, very important, especially for for the field team. And when we as HCAI go out and observe these projects, it's very important for the inspector of record to have logs of all this information, because that's what we're going to refer to, right? And in the administrative code, it's required to have the IOR and those documents on site. So it's have those on site and be easily referenced, so we can that's one way to keep track and have the observation for the field staff at HCAI a little bit easier, make your project a little smoother as well. So the change, as far as NMA change, the removal of project scope, is that an NMA change?
It goes back to the previous question. It's going to depend on the scope. If you're moving a big portion of work, you're probably going to be an ACD to remove that scope of work. Again, just because something's removed doesn't just remove scope, but we have to make sure the remaining construction is compliant, that you're not removing required functions from the scope that are required to make the project compliant. So, but if you have 2 doors in a room and you're just removing one of them for cost-wise, then it's an NMA. Okay, it depends on what you're removing as far as scope. So again, if you're confused, call and ask.
Yeah, if you're confused, call and ask. Reach out to our field staff team. Always a good resource to just clarify this for you if you still need a little more assistance with that. So how does an NMA affect a TIO milestone? I don't know if Richard or Monica, you'd like to answer that.
I can answer if you want.
Go for it.
So TIO is a living document, and ideally, if it's possible, do not submit with the NMA the TIO. So usually it happens that if there is a change of an NMA, that gets concurred, and then there is the TIO update, which includes an additional milestone that is part of the TIO review. But try please not to include the TIO into the NMA if it's possible.
So Richard, thank you, Monica, for that. Richard, this last question, or maybe second to last question that we'll ask is, can it be assumed that all structural issues do not qualify for an NMA unless there is a list considered acceptable to meet NMA?
No, Again, look at the CAN. There is a section on structural, what would qualify as NMAs. As in the list, there's a bunch of examples, not a lot of examples as NMA structural, but there are a few. And there's also some that are considered material, just to provide some clarifications. So now don't assume just because it's structural that it cannot be an NMA.
All right. Well, that brings us to the hour-and-a-half mark. For those of you who submitted questions and we didn't get a chance to answer those, please feel free to send those questions over to regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. We'd be happy to have that discussion with you, or just answer that in an email form. So that email address is also on the screen that Richard is showing. Richard, any last comments before we go?
No, just thank you all for your time. Part of this outreach is to encourage communication and let you know what the expectations are. And hopefully one of the expectations is that you reach out to us and talk to us if you have questions. We're here to help you. We want to get these projects done as quickly as you can get them done, and we don't want to be an obstruction to that. So please reach out if you have any questions. And thank you again for attending.
Great, thank you. Monica, any last comments?
Just communicate with us, with the field staff. Communication is the key.
Great, thank you. And that's a very good point. If anything, if you took away anything from this, and just remember that communication is key. Use your resources here at HCAI. We're here to help, and we're here to make your project successful. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. We hope that you found this webinar to be helpful. Remember, if you didn't download the PDF handout, you can download it under the handout section of the GoTo Toolbox. That's under the handout section. It's there in PDF form. If you have any questions, send us an email over to regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. Again, that's regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. And if you've been following the webinars that we at HCAI have been presenting, we did the first part of OSHPD 3 clinics presentation yesterday. If you're interested in joining us for the second part but didn't register yet, log into our website and register for the second part, which is it's going to be scheduled for tomorrow at 1 o'clock. So register if you have time. Great information being presented, and we're hoping that you're finding these webinars to be useful. It's been a pleasure being with all of you today. Thank you for doing what you do and doing your part in providing access to safe, quality healthcare environments throughout the state of California. Thank you. Have a good day.